The hymn came in already dying, and we were already turning toward it before I understood it was a hymn at all. I had the chapel band watch that shift, which on a frigate means you have nothing. The chapel band is the oldest live channel humanity still keeps lit, a narrow sliver of frequency that our great-grandfathers reserved for the comfort of dying men and that nobody in 3 centuries has bothered to take back. On the Wexford, it terminated in a closet aft of the medbay, a steel cubby with a fold-down stool, a single amber readout, and a brass-rimmed speaker that nobody had spoken into in my 11 years aboard. I sat that watched the way a man sits with an old dog. You don't expect anything. You keep it company. So when the amber readout flickered and held, I thought it was a fault. Then it climbed and held again, and the brass speaker hissed and began to carry a voice. It was not a voice asking for help. That is the first thing I want set down plainly, because the inquiry afterward kept trying to make it one. It was a voice singing, low, four-throated in a register that bent under itself like water folding over a stone. I did not know the language. I did not need to. You learn, doing the work I do, what a death song sounds like in any throat that has lungs. This was that. Somewhere out in the dark, a great many somethings were singing themselves toward whatever they believed waited, and the song had found the one human channel still listening, and the channel had logged it, because that is what the channel is built to do. The log threw a tag onto my readout. Distress, chapel band origin unresolved. The system does not have a category for a funeral. It heard grief on the comfort frequency, and it called the grief by the only name it knows. I keyed the bridge before I had finished thinking. Chaplain's watch to command. I have live traffic on the chapel band. A pause. Then Lieutenant Okoro dry. The chapel band doesn't have traffic. Brother, it does now. I heard her chair turn. I heard faintly the bridge go quiet behind her, the particular quiet of people deciding whether to laugh. The Wexford was a patrol frigate 11 days out from the relay at Holland, running a sweep nobody expected to find anything in, and the chapel band lighting up was the kind of thing that becomes a story in the mess for a month. Then Okoro stopped being dry, reading it to the bridge speakers, she said. Hold, the song filled the command deck. I heard it twice over, once in my closet, once bleeding up the open channel from the bridge above me, and the two passes were a half-second apart, so that the dead and the nearly dead seemed to be singing in a round. Nobody on the bridge laughed. Captain Hale's voice came down the line flat and unhurried. Brother Crane, you've heard more of these than anyone on this ship. Tell me what I'm listening to. You're listening to a last rite, sir. My own voice sounded strange to me. A lot of throats. They're not calling anyone. They've stopped calling anyone. They're singing because they've decided no one's coming. Then why did it tag distress? Because the band can't tell the difference, sir. Grief and a Mayday come in on the same wire. The men who built it knew that. They left it that way on purpose. There was a silence on the line that I have thought about many times since. It was not indecision. Hale was not a man who took long to decide things. I had served under him for 6 years and watched him commit a ship in less time than it takes to clear your throat. The silence was him reading the same thing I was reading and arriving at the same place by a colder road. A great many voices. A last rite. No call for help because help had been ruled out. Helm, he said, off the line, but I caught it. Give me a bearing on that carrier. Whatever's making it. Working it, sir. It's faint. Sir, that's deep. That's a long way off our sweep. I didn't ask if it was convenient. Give me a bearing. I sat in my closet with the brass speaker warm under my hand and listened to the song fold over itself, and I understood, before the bridge understood, that we were going to turn. Not because anyone had asked us to. Nobody out there had asked us anything. They had aimed their grief at their own ancestors, at whatever waited past the edge of their believing, and a piece of dead human plumbing had caught the edge of it and called it a cry for help. We were 11 days out, the wrong ship, on the wrong frequency, listening to a prayer that was never meant for us. We turned anyway. I should tell you what the Wexford was, so you understand the size of what answered and the size of what didn't. She was a frigate, 1 hull, 41 crew. She carried a single spinal coil gun, a brace of point defense turrets, a med bay rated for 18, and a hold that on this run was 2/3 empty because we were 11 days from resupply. She was not a rescue. She was not a fleet. She was the smallest serious thing the human Navy puts in the black. And she was alone. Because that is what you are 11 days out on a sweep nobody believes in. There was no convoy behind us. There was no armada to call. There was the Wexford. And there was the song. And there was the distance between them. And the distance was the whole problem. Time to intercept at flank, Hale said. 19 hours, sir. I heard him take that in. 19 hours is a long time to listen to people die. It is long enough to wonder whether you are doing a kindness or only insisting on witnessing. Brother Crane. Sir. Can you talk back on that band? I looked at the brass speaker. In 11 years, I had never keyed it open. It transmits, sir. Whether they can hear it, Whether their gear is even built to catch our wire, I don't know. We'd be shouting into a frequency they've never listened to because they don't know it exists. Then shout, Hale said. If they've decided no one's coming, I'd like the record to show somebody answered. I want to be honest about what I felt because the inquiry wanted heroics and there weren't any. What I felt was dread, not of the dark and not of the long odds, but of the specific cruelty of the situation, which I understood already, and which the rest of the ship would understand by degrees over the next 19 hours. We had heard them too late. The song told me that in its bones. It is not a song you sing when there is still a chance. It is the song you sing when the chance is gone, and the only thing left to get right is the leaving. I keyed the brass speaker open. The readout flushed from amber to a steady working green I had never seen it hold. I did not have their language. I had 2 words of comfort that work in any throat, that the men who built the band had meant for exactly this. And I said them into 300 years of dead air and a stranger's grief and a distance no honest captain should have committed a single hull to cross. Heard you, I said. For a long moment the song did not change. Then far off on the folded edge of it, one throat among the many faltered, not stopped but caught the way a man catches when he has been speaking into a room he was sure was empty and a board creaks behind him. Somebody out there had heard a sound come back. The faltering voice belonged to a being I would come to know as their efficient, their version of me, the throat appointed to lead the others over the edge. His name, when at last it came across in fragments our translators could chew, sounded like Memnoch Var, and the title that traveled with it meant something closer to Keeper of the Last Door than Chaplain. I will call him the Keeper, because that is what he was. For the first 6 hours he did not speak to me, he sang. I understood, listening, that he could not stop singing without abandoning the others, and that he had decided whatever board had creaked behind him was a trick of his own. Exhaustion, a kindness his mind had invented to spare him the work of believing. So he sang, I kept the band open, and every so often I gave him the 2 words again. Heard you. I did not crowd him. You do not crowd a man at that door. The bridge fed me what they could piece together. The carrier was a pilgrim convoy. That was the nearest word our archive offered for it. Not a navy, not a merchant line. A migration. 1,100 and some odd souls, the translators thought, aboard a string of low-power vessels built for moving the faithful between stars at a crawl, the kind of slow holy traffic that an empire tolerates and never protects. They had been making for a Shrine World 3 systems over. A drive on the lead hull had failed in deep transit, and a failed drive on a slow ship is not a fire and not an explosion. It is a clock. Their air was the clock. They had hailed their own. First their escort, which had none, then the Empire's emergency network, which logged them and ranked them and put them in a queue, and then, when the queue did not move, their ancestors. That was the part the inquiry could never make peace with. They had not sent the death song to us. They had not sent it anywhere a living thing could catch it. They had aimed it inward and upward, at the spirits of their own dead, on a chapel frequency their faith reserved for exactly that. And by an accident of physics and 3-century-old human stubbornness the aimed grief had grazed Vifan channel we still keep lit for the dying. They had prayed past us, and we had been standing where the prayer went over. At hour 7, the keeper spoke. It came in slow, run through every filter we had, and what reached me was thin and formal and very tired. You are not an ancestor, he said. No, I said. You answer on the ancestor band. It isn't the ancestor band where I am. It's an old channel for comforting the dying. I think the 2 run close together. I think your song stepped across. A long pause. I could hear the others behind him. The song thinned now, fewer throats. Then you have heard a thing not meant for you, he said. I ask your forgiveness for the intrusion. I have turned that sentence over more times than I can count. He was dying, and his first instinct on finding a stranger on the line was to apologize for the trespass. There's nothing to forgive, I told him. But I have to ask you something, and I need a true answer. How long do you have? He gave me a figure in his own measure, and the translators rendered it, and Okoro did the conversion, and her voice on the internal line went very careful. 14 hours. The keeper's convoy had 14 hours of air, spread thin and getting thinner as the failing systems leaked. The Wexford was 19 hours out at flank. We were going to be 5 hours late. I keyed the bridge. Captain, he says 14 hours. We're 19. I have the numbers, brother. Then I'm asking what I think you're already asking yourself. Hale didn't answer me. He answered the ship. The address came over every speaker on the Wexford, level and brief, the way he said everything. All hands. We are running to a convoy of civilians who do not have enough air to wait for us. As it stands, we arrive 5 hours after they suffocate. I am not willing to file that report. Engineering, I want options that get me 5 hours, and I want them in 20 minutes. Everyone else, find me a way to give a dying ship air across a gap I can't close in time. The brother has the line to their efficient, keep it warm. That's all. He clicked off. And the strangest thing happened on that frigate. The thing the inquiry should have written down and didn't. 41 people who had been told they could not arrive in time stopped treating it as a fact and started treating it as a problem. The chief engineer, a flint-faced woman named Adisa, came on the line inside 10 minutes, not 20. I can give the captain 90 minutes off the clock if he lets me overrun the drive past the rated ceiling. It'll cook the coil. We'd limp home, but we'd get there 90 minutes sooner. 90 minutes leaves us 3.5 hours late, Okoro said. I know what it leaves. He asked for options. That's an option. Burn it, Hale said. What else? What else was a young rating in stores named Pell, who had been listening on the open channel the way the whole ship was listening, and who keyed in with his voice cracking because he was 19 and had never spoken to a captain before. Sir, the survey drones. The atmosphere drones. They're built to fly down into gas giants and sample air. They can fly the other way. We could load them out of our own reserve and shoot them ahead at drone flank. They're faster than we are. They'd get there before us. A silence on the line. Then Adisa slowly, how many do we carry? 6, Chief. And how much breathable does a survey drone hold? Not much, Pell admitted. An hour maybe for a few hundred. But 6 of them staggered, buys the gap, Hale said. Get them loaded. And then the ship did the thing I have never been able to describe to anyone's full belief, which is that it kept going. The drones were not the end of it. The drones were the first layer. Once Hale had shown the crew that the impossible problem would yield to enough, the small hammers did not stop coming. The medical officer worked out that we could pre-stage our own atmosphere reserve into transferable cells now in the hours we still had, so that the moment we mated to a hull, we could push air faster than any standard protocol allowed. She spent 6 hours rigging a manifold for it out of parts that were not meant for it. The quartermaster stripped the ship of every portable rebreather and emergency hood we carried, 200 and some, and staged them at the airlocks, because a hood on a dying pilgrim buys minutes and minutes were the whole currency now. A bosun's mate named Tarrant, who I would not have credited with the thought, worked out that the convoy's failing hulls might not have human-compatible docking rings, and spent the back half of the run fabricating a universal soft collar mate that would let us seal to a hull whose architecture we'd never seen. When we reached the convoy, it worked on the first 4 hulls and failed on the 5th, and the 4 it worked on are why 290 people are alive. None of these were ordered. Hale had asked for ways to give a dying ship air across a gap he could not close, and the ship had heard the question the way you hear a thing on the comfort band, as a thing addressed to all of us, and it had answered in 200 small competent voices at once, each person finding the one hammer that was theirs to swing. That is the part the inquiry could not file and the plaques do not carry. There was no single act of heroism on the Wexford. There were 41 people refusing, in 41 small ways, to accept an arithmetic that had already written off the people on the other end of a song. The drones bought the hours, but the drones were only the loudest of the hammers. Behind them was a whole ship that had stopped asking whether it could arrive in time and started asking only what it could do with the time it had. Brother Crane, sir, tell their efficient that the first thing arriving is not a ship. It's 6 small machines and they're carrying air, and his people need to be ready to take it aboard, however they take air aboard. Tell him it isn't much. Tell him it's the front of the line. I put it to the keeper as plainly as I could. 6 machines, not enough, the front of the line. I braced for him to ask why a thing too small to save them was worth the sending. He did not ask that. What he said, after a silence in which I could hear him deciding whether to believe me, was, you are still 19 hours away. You will not arrive in time. And you are sending what you have ahead of you anyway. Yes, why? It was the same question Hale had answered for the whole ship, and I gave the keeper the only piece of it I owned. Because we heard you, I said, and once you've heard a thing, you don't get to unhear it. The arriving is just the part that comes after. We shot the drones at hour 8, all 6, staggered an hour apart so the air would arrive in a line instead of a clump. Pell loaded them himself and named each one, which is a thing a 19-year-old does and an officer pretends not to hear. The drive went into overrun at the same hour, and the Wexford began to shudder, in a way frigates are not built to shudder, a deep periodic groan through the deck plates, like the ship clearing its throat over and over. Adisa rode the coil temperature by hand, because the automatics wanted to throttle back, and she would not let them. The keeper kept the death song going under all of it. I asked him once, gently, whether he might stop it now that something was coming, and he told me no, that the song was not a request and never had been, that it was the work of seeing the dying across, and that a thing coming did not change the fact that some of them were going to cross before it got there. He would not lie to his own people with hope he could not guarantee. He sang them toward the door, and he kept one ear on my band for the sound that came back. And somewhere in the middle of those hours, the two things stopped being separate in his mind. He began to leave gaps in the song where my two words went, so that the death rite of his people grew a human response woven into it that none of their ancestors had ever spoken. I do not know what their faith made of that then or after. I only know he made room for it. There was a stretch around hour 8 and 9, after the drones were away and before the first one arrived, where the worst work of the whole passage got done, and it was not heroic work, and the inquiry skipped over it because it does not photograph. It was triage. Across a dead frequency in a language we were still assembling word by word, Hale's medical officer and I had to work out with the keeper which of his 11 hulls the drones should reach first. There were not enough drones for all of them at once. A drone arriving at a ship that still had 2 hours of air did less good than the same drone arriving at a ship with 20 minutes left. So we had to ask the keeper, who was leading the death rite for all of them, to tell us which of his people were closest to the door, so we could send the air to those and let the others wait. Knowing that some of the ones we made wait would not get a second drone in time. I have asked many hard things of dying men across a comfort band. I had never asked one to rank his own people for the order of their dying. The keeper did it. He did not flinch from it, and he did not pretend it was anything other than what it was. He went hull by hull and gave us the order, the ones nearest the door first, his voice steady and formal, and breaking only once, on the third hull, which I learned later held the children, which he ranked exactly where the air figures said it belonged and not one place higher, because he would not let his own grief move a drone off the ship that needed it more. I have thought about that more than almost anything else from those 19 hours. A man with his own air running out, sorting his people into the order they would die in, and refusing to cheat the arithmetic even to save the children first, because cheating it would have killed someone else's children on another hull. The concordance jurist, months later, called the convoy's faith primitive in passing, a slip he apologized for. I have never met a concordance officer who could have done what the keeper did at hour 8. I am not sure I could have done it. I only had to relay it. The first drone reached the convoy at hour 9, an hour before its air would have mattered, and there was a bad stretch then where the keeper's people did not know what the machine was and would not open to it. It is a hard thing to ask a frightened dying crowd to crack a working seal for a small alien object nosing at their hull. The keeper walked them through it himself, throat by throat, hatch by hatch, and I heard him do it, heard his formal exhausted voice turn practical and coaxing, and I understood I was listening to a man who had been ready to die do the harder work, of staying useful instead. The drone made it to the lead hull and bled its air across, and the song on the band gained back 4 throats it had lost. Then we lost the third drone. It came apart on approach. A survey drone is not built to fly the way we were flying it, and one of the 6 simply tore itself open against the convoy's slow tumble and spent its air into the black for nothing. I heard the keeper register the loss, a single drop note, and then keep going. 3 drones left. The clock kept running. The Wexford shuddered and groaned and ate the distance, and it was plainly not going to be enough. At hour 14, the convoy's air ran out. It did not run out all at once. It ran out the way air runs out on a string of failing ships, unevenly, the worst hulls first. I was on the band when the first of them went quiet. The song had a shape to it by then that I had learned, a layered breathing thing with the keeper's throat at its center, and I heard a section of it thin and falter and fall away, and I knew without being told that a whole vessel of the faithful had just crossed the door the keeper had been holding for them. He did not stop. He folded the missing voices into the song as something completed rather than something lost, and he kept the rite going for the ones still breathing, and his voice did not break. And I sat in my steel closet 4 hours out and listened to a man bury his people one ship at a time while he waited for help that had heard him and could not run fast enough. I want to set down what that did to the Wexford because it is the part that matters. We were a frigate. We had done everything a frigate could do, burned the coil, spent the drones, committed the hull, kept the band warm. And it was not enough, and we knew by hour 14 it was not going to be enough. And the question that settles on a ship in that hour is whether to ease off. The math had stopped rewarding us. Every hour of overrun now was buying the lives of people who were already dying faster than we could reach. A reasonable Navy throttles back. A reasonable Navy saves the coil, saves the crew, arrives intact to do what good is left. Hale did not throttle back. He came on the band himself at hour 15. The only time in the whole affair he spoke to the keeper directly, breaking his own custom, and what he said was not comfort. "Keeper, this is the master of the vessel inbound. I am told you are holding a rite for your dead even now. I won't interrupt it. I am calling to tell you one thing so you can carry it in the song if it helps, and set it down if it doesn't. We are coming as fast as a ship can come and faster than this one was built to. We will not all be in time. But we are not slowing down for the arithmetic. Where there is still air, we will reach it. Where there is not, we will reach it anyway. And we will not leave what we find. That is the whole of it. Resume. And he clicked off and let the man go back to his work. The fourth drone died at hour 16, and the fifth held and the sixth held. And between the two of them and the bleeding remnants of the first, the keeper kept 11 hulls worth of dying people clinging to enough air to argue with. By hour 17, the song had lost more than half its throats. By hour 18, it was the keeper and a thin chorus and the long gaps where my two words went, and I had stopped sleeping, and the Wexford was a single hour out and shaking herself to pieces to make it. I will tell you the thing the inquiry most wanted to disbelieve, and which 41 of us would swear to under any oath. In that last hour, with his people more than half gone and his own air going, the keeper asked me about us. The two words, he said. His voice had gone to almost nothing. They are a right on your channel for the dying. They're not a right. They're just what you say. So a man doesn't go out thinking the room was empty on your world. When one of you is at the door, someone keeps the channel and says the words. Always, always, I said, for 300 years, even when nobody's on it, especially then. There was a silence, and in the silence I understood he was doing a thing I had no right to ask of a dying man, which was thinking about somebody other than his own. Then you did not send a ship to us by accident, he said slowly. Your people have kept a door open for the dying for 300 years, against no return for no one, and when grief came down it, you were already standing there. The accident was only that the grief was ours, a breath. You have been doing this the whole time. We simply prayed loudly enough, in the wrong direction, to be overheard. I did not have an answer for that worth giving him, so I gave him the words again, and he folded them into what was left of the song. The last hour was the worst of it, and I have never been able to make anyone who was not aboard understand why. We were close enough by then to see the convoy on our boards in detail, 11 hulls, slow tumbling, most of them gone cold, and the readout assigning each one a temperature that told us, plainer than any hail, which ships still held living warmth and which had become coffins. We watched two of the warm ones go cold in that final hour, not far off, close enough that another 20 minutes might have caught them. And the 20 minutes did not exist, because Adiza had already spent every minute the coil had in it, and there were no more to spend. I sat in my closet and watched a warm reading on Okoro's relayed board cool toward the dark, and I keyed the band and I gave the keeper the two words, and I knew saying them, that I was saying them to people who were already past hearing, and I said them anyway, because you do not know, in that last instant, who is still on the threshold and who has crossed, and the words cost nothing, and the silence cost everything. And there was a moment, I will set it down because the inquiry asked, and I told them and they wrote it down and underlined it and could not use it. When the keeper, with his own air thinning and two of his last warm hulls just gone cold, used a portion of his failing voice not on the right and not on his own crossing, but to tell me, formally, across the dead frequency, that whatever happened in the next hour, whether we reached anyone or no one, the door had been kept and his people had not died into silence, and that this was, by the lights of his faith, a completed thing and not a failed one, and that I was to carry that and not grieve. A man with minutes of air left, spending some of them to absolve the stranger who had arrived too late. I have kept it. I have not always managed not to grieve, but I have kept it. The Wexford fell out of overrun at hour 19 on the dot, into a stretch of dark hung with the convoy's slow tumbling hulls, most of them gone dark and silent, 3 of them still showing the faint warmth of held breath. Adisa's coil was finished. We would limp home on the auxiliaries for a month, but she had bought her 90 minutes, and the drones had bought their hours, and Hale had refused to give a single one of them back. And so we came over the convoy not 5 hours late, as the first math had promised, but 90 minutes late, into a graveyard with 3 lamps still lit in it. We saved them, the 3 warm hulls, and a 4th we found dark but not yet emptied, its people unconscious on the last threads of the drone air. 4 ships, 290 living souls out of 1,160. We put every one of them through our medbay rated for 18, stacked them in the hold and the mess and the chapel and the corridors, breathed our own reserve into them, and turned for Holland at a crawl that would take 5 weeks on the auxiliaries. And we did not leave the rest. That was Hale's order, and no one questioned it. The 8 dark hulls held the convoys dead, 870 of them, and a navy in a hurry leaves the dead for the salvage tugs and the Empire's slow bureaucracy. Hale would not. He had the Wexford take each dark hull, under tow and turn, mate to it, and let the keeper who lived, who was among the 290, who would not rest until it was done, lead his right through our speakers into each silent ship so that not one of his people crossed that door. Unattended, it took 2 days. We were a warship full of strangers' corpses and stranger survivors, crawling home on a dead coil, and we stopped at each cold hull and held the channel open while an alien chaplain sang his dead across on a human comfort frequency 3 centuries old. The Empire found us on the 3rd day. I should explain what the Empire was, as much as a chaplain ever understood it. The convoy had belonged to a faith that the Concordance, the great loose federation of species that ran that stretch of the black, tolerated the way a large house tolerates a small chapel in a far wing. The faithful were citizens of the Concordance in the way a tenant is a citizen of the building, present, counted, taxed, and not thought about. When their drive failed, they had hailed the Concordance's emergency network exactly as the law instructed, and the network had received them, logged them, assigned them a queue position, and assessed that a relief vessel could not be tasked to their position inside their air window. So the network had done the lawful thing. It had closed their case as a projected total loss and moved on to cases it could still affect. This is not cruelty. I have come to understand it is not even neglect. It is a very large machine doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic said these people were already dead, and the machine was not wrong about that. It was only wrong about us. The vessel that found us was a Concordance cutter, lean and fast and badly surprised, dispatched not to help, the case was closed, but to investigate an anomaly in the closed case. The anomaly was that the case had stopped behaving like a total loss. Somewhere in the network's careful accounting, 290 souls it had written off were now broadcasting life signs from inside a hull that matched no registry the cutter carried. Their captain hailed us in the formal Concordance trade cant, and Hale put me on the channel beside Okoro, because by then I had spent 4 days speaking to the keeper and had picked up enough of the cant to be useful, and because Hale had decided, rightly, that this was going to be a conversation about a right and that I should be in it. The cutter's captain was named Sath Orele, and the first thing he wanted was not the survivors. The first thing he wanted was to understand how. Not how we had saved them. The drones, the overrun, the towing, all of that was in the data we shared, and he absorbed it without comment. What he could not absorb was the routing. He kept returning to it, circling it, the way the keeper had circled the same fact at the door. "You are not on our network," he said. "You hold no listening assignment in this sector. The distress was filed on Concordance emergency channels to which you have no access and no subscription. By what mechanism did your vessel receive a call your civilization is not party to?" "We didn't receive that call," I told him. "We never saw your network. The case you filed and closed, we never heard. We caught a different signal entirely. There was no different signal. The only transmission these vessels made after the network filing was," he stopped. I heard him pull the convoy's own logs, the record of every emission the dying ships had made, and I heard him find the thing I already knew was there. "A devotional broadcast," he said slowly, "liturgical, directed inward, the death-rite. It was not addressed to any recipient. It was not addressed at all. It is not a hail. It carries no distress header. By every standard, it is not a signal that requests anything." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't request anything. It's a song for the dying, sung to their own dead. It wasn't aimed at us. It wasn't aimed at anybody alive. It went up and out, the way grief goes, and a sliver of it grazed an old human frequency we keep lit for our own dying. And our equipment logged it as distress, because our equipment can't tell grief from a Mayday. That's the whole of the mechanism, Captain. There isn't more to it. You closed a case that asked for help and couldn't be answered. We answered a prayer that didn't ask for anything and wasn't sent to us." There was a long silence on the Concordance channel. I have learned that the silences in this business all sound alike and all mean different things. And this one I had not heard before. It was the silence of a man whose entire profession had just failed to contain something, and who was honest enough not to pretend otherwise. "Let me state it back," Satharel said at last, "so that the record is exact, because I will have to defend this record before people who will not believe it. A failing convoy made a lawful distress filing on our network. Our network received it, assessed it as unrecoverable, and closed it. That assessment was, by our arithmetic, correct. No Concordance asset could have reached them in time. The convoy then performed its death liturgy, which is not a distress call, which requests nothing, which was directed at no living recipient. That liturgy was overheard by accident by a single human vessel that is not party to our network, that was 11 days out of position, that should by every measure not have been able to hear it, and should by every measure not have answered it. And that vessel turned and burned its drive to ruin, and spent its stores, and arrived too late to save most of them, and saved some of them anyway, and then stayed to bury the rest." He paused. "Have I stated it correctly?" "Nearly," I said. "You said we shouldn't have been able to answer it. We were always able to answer it. We've kept that channel open and staffed for 300 years against no return and for no one. The only accident was that this time, the grief that came down it was yours. I heard him take that in. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, the formal cant loosening into something more like a man and less like an office. Your people keep a frequency open for the dying, he said. Always. Even with no one on it. Especially then. Why, it was the third time someone had asked me that. The keeper then threw him his whole convoy, and now an officer of an empire I had never heard of a month before. I gave Satharelli the same answer I had given the rest, because it was the only true one I had, and because I had stopped being surprised that it was the thing they could not file. So that no one goes out into the dark thinking the room was empty, I said. It's not a strategy, Captain. It's not aid policy. It's just a thing we decided a long time ago and never stopped doing. You build the door. You keep it open. You sit the watch even when the watch is nothing. And then one day a prayer comes down it from a species you've never met, and you're already there, because that was the whole point of being there. Satharella was on our hull for 2 days, doing the slow, careful work his profession required, and I watched the realization arrive in him by stages the way it had arrived in the keeper. He examined our chapel band closet himself, climbing aft of the med bay to stand in the steel cubby and look at the fold-down stool and the brass-rimmed speaker and the single amber readout, and I think it was the smallness of it that undid him more than anything else. He had expected, I believe, to find some dedicated human listening apparatus, a deliberate galaxy-spanning watchnet, the sort of infrastructure his own concordance would have built if it had decided to keep such a vigil. Instead, he found a closet, a man on a stool. A frequency so old its purpose was half forgotten, kept alive by nothing grander than a refusal to switch it off. He stood in that cubby a long time, and when he came out, he said a thing I have never forgotten, in the loosened cant of a man speaking past his office. You did not build a net to catch the dying. You left a single door unlatched for 300 years and forgot it was unlatched, and the dark walked a grief through it. That is worse. A net I could plan against. I do not know how to plan against a people who simply never close anything. He filed his report, and his report became the seed of the inquiry, and somewhere in the filing of it he had to invent language his own service did not possess. There was no concordance phrase for what we had done, because the concordance had never needed one. They had words for aid dispatched and aid withheld, for the calculus of who could be reached. They had no word for aid that arrived too late on purpose, for a watch kept against no return, for a door that answered a call it was never sent. Satharella had to leave gaps in his own report where the words should have been, the same way the keeper had left gaps in his song, and I understood, watching him do it, that we had not merely saved a convoy. We had handed an entire civilization a whole in its own language, a thing it could see and could not name, and that the whole would sit in their records like the empty field on the form, quietly insisting that their map of how aid worked was missing a country. The concordance did not know what to do with us, and the not knowing took the shape of an inquiry. They convened it at the relay world of Holland, where we limped in 5 weeks later on dead auxiliaries with 290 survivors and 870 dead, and a coil we'd have to cut out and replace. The inquiry was concordance run, but they let a human delegation sit it, and they let me sit it because I had been on the band, and they made the keeper sit it because he had lived, and because no one else could speak to what had happened inside the dying ships. I had not seen him in the flesh until then. He was tall and narrow and gray-throated, four-lunged, with a face built for an expression I could not read but a posture I could, the posture of a man who has spent his strength and is not getting it back. We had spoken for 4 days across a dead frequency and never seen each other. When we finally stood in the same room, neither of us said anything for a while. There was nothing to say that the band hadn't already carried. The inquiry wanted to assign the event a category, because that is what inquiries are for. The concordance ran on categories the way a body runs on blood, and a thing without a category was, to them, a kind of wound. They had a category for a successful rescue. They had a category for a lawful denial of aid. They had a category for jurisdictional trespass, for unauthorized contact, for the use of a closed case by a non-party. They tried each of these on the event in turn, and each one failed, because each one assumed a thing about the event that was not true. It was not a rescue, because a rescue arrives in time. We had not. Most of them had died. It was not a lawful denial of aid because aid had been rendered. 290 lived. It was not jurisdictional trespass because we had never touched their network. We had not used their closed case. We had heard a thing their network did not even classify as a signal and was not built to protect. It was not unauthorized contact because we had not initiated contact. We had answered a prayer that was not addressed to us, and answering a thing not addressed to you is not, in any concordance statute, a defined act at all. The convener, a concordance jurist, robed patient, plainly intelligent, kept arriving at the same wall. He laid it out near the end of the second day with a kind of weary precision I have come to respect. I have a vessel that rendered aid it was not obligated to render, in response to a transmission that requested nothing, sent to no one, on a channel it had no right to receive and every technical ability to receive. I have aid that was both too late to be a rescue and too effective to be a denial. I have a contact event with no contact, a jurisdiction with no jurisdiction, and a closed case that reopened itself by dying differently than predicted. He looked at the human delegation, and then longer at me. Your civilization has handed mine an event for which we have no file. I find that I am less interested in punishing it than in understanding how you live with so many of them. That was the first time I heard a concordance officer say aloud the thing I had been feeling since hour one in my closet, that the trouble was never what we had done. The trouble was that what we had done did not fit anywhere, and they were a people for whom fitting somewhere was how a thing became real. The keeper spoke once, on the third day, and the room went still for it. He had said almost nothing through the proceedings, deferring, recovering, gray and quiet at the survivors' table. But when the convener asked him, formally, whether the human vessel's conduct had violated the sanctity of his people's death right, for there were, among the concordance faithful, those who held that the right was profaned by a stranger's voice woven into it, and the question had to be put, the keeper rose. I led the right, he said. His translated voice filled the chamber slow and certain. I held the door for 870 of my people as they crossed it, and I will hold it in memory for the rest of my life. I am the only authority in this chamber on whether that right was profaned, and I tell you it was not. A voice answered on the comfort band. It did not ask to lead. It did not presume to bless. It said 2 words again and again for 19 hours, and the words were heard you, and it never said anything else, and it never stopped. I do not know what your statutes make of that. I know what a dying man makes of it. When my people crossed the door, they did not cross it thinking the room was empty. For 300 years, these creatures have kept a watch at that door for their own dead. And when our grief came down it by accident, the watch was kept for us too, by a stranger who had every reason to throttle his drive and save his ship and file us as the arithmetic had already filed us. He did not. None of them did. You may call that whatever your files require. I will call it what it was. The watch was kept. Find your category around that. Sat down. The convener did not try a category on it after that. I have run ahead of myself, the way a man does when the ending sits heavier than the middle. Let me go back to the dark, because the inquiry never understood the middle, and the middle is where the thing was actually decided. Between hour 8, when we fired the drones, and hour 19, when we fell out of overrun into the graveyard, the Wexford was not a ship doing a clean, heroic thing. She was a ship doing 100 ugly, partial things, none of them sufficient, all of them necessary, and the worst part of those 11 hours was that we could see exactly how much we were failing in real time. The convoy's life signs were on our boards. We watched them go out. You do not, in the stories, get told what it is to watch a number that means breathing people tick downward on a display while your drive screams and your distance closes too. Slowly to matter, I will tell you. It is the loneliest arithmetic in the world, and there were 41 of us doing it together, which made it worse and made it bearable in the same motion. Pell, the young rating who had thought of the drones, did not leave the drone control station for those 11 hours. He flew them by hand at the end, when the automatics could no longer thread them through the convoy's tumble, and he lost 2 of his 6 that way, and saved hundreds with the other 4. And he did not forgive himself for the 2 for a long time after. I sat with him later when it was over, the way I sit with the dying, except he was the opposite of dying. He was a boy who had done more good in 11 hours than most men manage in a life, and could only see the part that got away. 2 of them came apart, he kept saying. If you'd flown them slower, the air would have arrived later, and more of them would be dead. I told him, you flew them at the edge of what they'd take. Some of them couldn't take it. That's not the same as a mistake. That's the price of the edge. You don't get the saved hundreds without standing at the edge where the drones tear. He didn't believe me then. He believes me now. It took years. Adisa rode her coil to death by hand. The drive safety systems wanted to throttle back 4 separate times in those 11 hours. Each time the temperature crossed a line some engineer a century ago had drawn as the limit of sanity, and 4 times she overrode it, watching the coil cook, trading a month of crawling home for 90 minutes she would not give back. When it finally let go, it did not explode. She'd nursed it too well for that. It simply died, a long descending whine through the whole hull, and she stood up from her station gray-faced and said to her engine, not to anyone in the room, "That'll do. That'll do now," the way you'd say it to an animal that had run itself out for you. We limped the next 5 weeks on auxiliaries because of those 90 minutes. 290 people are alive because of them. Adisa would make the same trade today and call it arithmetic, and she would be right, and it would still be the bravest arithmetic I have ever watched a person do. And hail. I have served under men who were brave in the loud way, the way that fills a room and recruits a crew and gets written into the citations. Hale was brave in the quiet way that the citations cannot hold, which is that he made the cold decisions and then made the warm ones and never let anyone see the seam. He committed the hull, when committing it, was arguably negligent. A frigate 11 days out, abandoning a sweep, burning toward a closed case it had no orders to touch, to arrive too late. A board could have ended his career on any line of that. He knew it when he gave the order. He gave it anyway, in the flat, unhurried voice, and then he did the thing that I think was harder than the commitment. He refused, at hour 14, to let the failing arithmetic talk him into easing off. The rational move at hour 14 was to throttle the dying coil, save the ship, arrive intact, and salvage what dignity remained. Hale would not buy his dignity with their hours. He kept the drive and overrun against the math, against the safe and reasonable course. Because somewhere out in the dark a man was singing his people across a door, and Hale had decided that the Wexford would be there for as much of it as a ship could possibly be there for, and not 1 minute less. I asked him about it once, years after, when we were both old enough to ask each other things. Hour 14, I said. You'd done the math. You knew most of them were gone. Why didn't you ease off? He thought about it the way he thought about everything, like a man checking a chart he already knew by heart. Because easing off is a thing you do to a problem, he said. And by hour 14 it had stopped being a problem. By hour 14 it was a vigil. You don't optimize a vigil, brother. You keep it or you don't. I keep it. He looked at me. You taught me that, sitting in your closet with a dead frequency for 11 years. I just hadn't needed it until then. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which is most of my profession anyway. The survivors changed the ship for those 5 weeks and changed us. 290 pilgrims stacked in every space a body would fit, breathing our reserve, gray-throated and four-lunged and so quiet. They were a quiet people even in extremity, a faith built around the keeping of stillness, that the loudest sound on the Wexford for 5 weeks was the auxiliary drives and the keeper's voice, because the keeper would not stop. Even after the dead were buried, even after the rite was technically complete, he kept a watch of his own. He had learned what our chapel band was, and he asked Hale's permission, formally, to keep it lit and staffed from the survivors' side for the duration of the journey home, so that any of his people who slipped away from their injuries in those 5 weeks would not cross the door untended either. Hale granted it without a word. And so for 5 weeks, the oldest live frequency humanity keeps, the closet aft of the medbay with the brass speaker and the fold-down stool, was manned around the clock by an alien chaplain and his people, keeping the human watch for the human dead and the alien dead alike, because we had taught them how it was done by accident, by doing it the way we had taught them everything we knew about ourselves in those 19 hours, which was simply that we keep the door and we keep it open, and we sit the watch even when the watch is nothing, especially then. 11 of the survivors died in those 5 weeks of injuries we could not mend, with a medbay rated for 18. The keeper sang every one of them across. By the end he had a few human words woven through the rite, heard you among them, and none of his elders objected anymore, and I think that is the truest thing I can tell you about what happened to us out there. We did not convert them, and they did not convert us. But for 5 weeks, 2 species kept one watch, and when it was over, neither of us could entirely remember which words had originally been whose. The concordance did, in the end, render a verdict, and the verdict mattered less than what it cost them to reach it. They could not find us guilty of anything, because we had broken nothing. That wall the convener had hit on the second day held all the way to the last. But a concordance inquiry is not built only to assign blame. It is built to fold an event back into the body of law so that the next event, like it, has a precedent to fall into, and that was the part they could not do. And the failing of it changed something in them I do not think they expected. Here is the difficulty as their jurist finally framed it, and I sat in the chamber and watched him frame it and understood I was watching a man take apart his own foundations carefully so they would not fall on anyone. The Concordance Emergency Network worked on a single principle, that aid is a resource, finite, to be allocated where it can do good. This is a sound principle. It is, I think, the only principle a large civilization can actually run on. A distress call comes in. The network assesses whether any asset can reach it in time to matter. If yes, it tasks the asset. If no, it closes the case, because committing an asset to a loss it cannot prevent is a waste that will cost some other case its salvation. The arithmetic is cold, but it is not cruel. It saves more lives than sentiment would. The convoy's case was closed correctly under that principle. No concordance asset could have reached them. To have sent one would have been to spend a ship on the dead and deny it to the living. And then a human frigate, operating on no principle the network recognized, had committed itself to exactly the loss the arithmetic forbade, had spent its drive, its stores, its margin, on a case already closed, and had come away with 290 living souls in a graveyard tended instead of abandoned. The arithmetic said that was a waste. The 290 living souls said the arithmetic was missing a variable, and the missing variable, the jurist said slowly, near the end was not a number at all, it was the watch. Your network, he said to the human delegation, assesses whether aid can arrive in time. It is a good question. It is the wrong first question. The human vessel did not ask whether it could arrive in time. It asked whether it could arrive. The distinction seems small. It is not small. A civilization that asks only whether it can arrive in time will, correctly and lawfully, abandon everyone it cannot reach in time, and will be right by its own arithmetic every single time, and will never once be there for the crossing. A civilization that asks merely whether it can arrive will sometimes arrive too late, and waste itself doing it, and be there anyway. We built the first kind. We built it deliberately, and well, and it has saved more of us than I can count. But it was never going to hear a death song. It was never even going to listen for one. It had closed the case. He paused for a long time. These people keep a frequency open for grief that asks for nothing. We closed a case that asks for everything. I am not certain today which of us is the more advanced civilization, and I have been certain of that my entire life. The verdict, when it came, was 3 sentences. The human vessel Wexford had violated no concordance statute. The concordance emergency network would, going forward, maintain a standing passive watch on the human comfort band frequency by treaty with human consent, so that a death-rite would never again be heard only by accident and only by strangers. And the concordance entered into its permanent record a new classification, the first new classification its emergency directorate had created in 400 years, for an event that its existing files could not hold. Aid rendered to a closed case in response to an unaddressed transmission by a non-party under no obligation. They did not give it a number. The jurist refused to give it a number. He said a thing that should never be given a number should not be given one, and he left the field on the form blank, permanently as a reminder. I am told the blank field is still there. I am told they call it, informally, the keeper's case, and that no one has filed a second one, and that everyone who works the directorate knows what the empty field means. That is what it cost them. It cost them a certainty 400 years old. They had believed that a sufficiently good machine, fed sufficiently good arithmetic, would always do the right thing, because the right thing was a computable quantity. And we had handed them, by accident, on a frequency they had no business hearing, the proof that it was not, that there was a thing the arithmetic could not see, a thing that did not request aid and could not be allocated and arrived too late to matter and mattered anyway, and that the only way to be there for it was to be there before it called, keeping a door you had no reason to keep, for no one, against no return. I want to be careful here, because the inquiry tempted everyone toward a flattering story, and I have spent the rest of my life refusing the flattering version. We were not better people than the concordance. The men of the Wexford were not saints, and I was not a prophet. I was a chaplain who sat a dead watch for 11 years, because the Navy had nowhere else to put a man of my calling, and I was too stubborn to resent it. The concordance was not callous. Their network was a kindness, a vast functioning kindness that I came to admire. The difference between us was not virtue, it was a habit. 300 years ago, some humans, for reasons lost to record, had decided to keep a channel lit for the dying and never to close it no matter how empty it stayed, and we had kept that habit out of inertia and sentiment, and a refusal to be the people who turned it off, and the habit had cost us almost nothing for 3 centuries, a frequency, a closet, a man on a stool. Right up until the morning, it caught a prayer from a species we had never met and made us the only door in the dark that happened to be open. That is the whole of the advantage. Not strength, not speed. We were the wrong ship, 11 days out, on the wrong frequency, too small and too slow and too late. The only thing we had that the concordance did not was a door we had never gotten around to closing. It turned out to be enough to save 290 people. It turned out to be enough to give 870 attended crossing instead of an abandoned one. It turned out to be enough to make a 400-year-old empire leave a field on a form blank forever. It was a very small thing. We had simply never turned it off. The keeper's faith had a harder reckoning than the concordance's law, and I had a seat at it I did not deserve. Their religion, as I came slowly to understand it across years of letters and the occasional long visit, was built around a single conviction, that the dead were not gone but waiting, and that the living owed them the labor of being sung across, throat to throat, so that the crossing was never made alone. The death-rite was the central act of their faith. It was not a prayer for rescue. They were quite clear on this, and the clarity was the thing the concordance jurist had stumbled over. It was a prayer of accompaniment. You did not sing to be saved. You sang to make sure no one crossed unattended. The ancestors did not answer because the ancestors did not need to. Their part was to be on the far side of the door, waiting, and the rite's whole purpose was the keeping of company up to the threshold, not across it. So you can see the problem the Wexford handed them. For their entire recorded history, the rite had been a closed thing, a circle of the living singing the dying across to the waiting dead, with nothing coming back, because nothing was supposed to come back. The silence on the far side was not absence. It was the ancestors keeping faith by waiting quietly. And then in the worst hour their faith had ever recorded, with 870 of their people crossing and the rite straining at its limit, something had come back. 2 words, on the comfort band, again and again for 19 hours. Heard you. A voice from the dark that was not an ancestor, that did not belong to the waiting dead, that answered when answering was not part of the architecture of their belief. What does a faith do with that? I am not qualified to say what theirs did. In the end, across all its branches, there were schisms, the keeper told me, quiet ones, in the way of a quiet people. There were those who held the human voice a profanation, and those who held it a sign, and a great many in the middle who simply did not know and went on singing. But I can tell you what the keeper did with it, because he told me in a letter I have kept that I will quote the heart of, because it is his and not mine, and he said it better than I could. I have spent my life, he wrote, teaching that the dead cross alone but accompanied, that we sing them to the door and they pass through it singly into the keeping of those who waited. I believe the far side held only our own. I was wrong about the architecture, and I find I am not grieved by the error but enlarged by it. When my people crossed, in the worst of it, there was a voice on the far edge of the door that none of our scripture had placed there. It was not an ancestor. It was a stranger of another flesh entirely who had built a door of his own for his own dead and kept it open so long and so faithfully that ours blew across the threshold of his. I do not think this unmakes our faith. I think it completes a sentence we had only ever spoken half of. We sing the dying across so they do not cross alone. We had assumed we were the only ones singing. We were not. The dark is full of doors kept open by strangers against no return, and on the night we needed it most we found we had been singing toward one of them the whole time without knowing it was there. I have stopped teaching that the dead cross alone. I teach now that the dead cross toward whoever has kept a door, and that the keeping of a door for strangers is the highest form of the rite, and I learned this from a human who would tell you, with great embarrassment, that he was only doing his job. He was not wrong that I would say that. I have said it many times. It does not stop being true for being humble. 2 of the convoy survivors took human chaplain training. Years later, the first of their kind to do it, and not the last. They wanted to learn the watch. They wanted to sit the door for human dead the way the door had been sat for theirs, to balance a debt that I told them, repeatedly, was not a debt, that we did not keep the watch in order to be repaid, that the whole point of the watch was that it expected nothing. They listened to me say that, and they nodded, and they did it anyway, and one of them, a young one who had been a child aboard the second-to-last hull we reached, who had breathed drone air on the threshold and lived, sits a comfort band watch now on a concordance station 3 systems from where her family died, lighting a frequency for the human and concordance dying alike, keeping a door open against no return. I have spoken to her on it. She uses the words. She learned them in the dark when she was 9, on the worst night of her life, and they were the first thing she heard that told her the room was not empty, and she has spent her life making sure the next person in the dark hears them too. That is the thing the inquiry could not file, and the network could not allocate, and the arithmetic could not see. We did not rescue a convoy. We turned a closed door into an open one in a faith that had believed all its doors were closed, and we did it by accident, by being where a prayer went over, because we had kept our own door open out of stubbornness for 300 years. The good we did was not the 290. Though God knows the 290 were everything to the 290. The good we did was the doors. We taught a quiet, ancient, careful people that the dark was full of watches being kept by strangers, and that grief sung in any direction, in any throat, would sooner or later graze a frequency someone had refused to turn off. And they took that, and they built more doors, and the dark got a little less empty for it. I do not know a better thing a chaplain can do with a life than that. And I did it by sitting on a fold-down stool keeping company with a dead frequency the way you keep company with an old dog, expecting nothing, until the morning it spoke. Our own Navy did not know what to do with us either, and I have always taken a stubborn comfort in that because it kept me honest about the story. We came into Holland 5 weeks late on dead auxiliaries with a ruined coil, 279 living survivors, 11 had died on the crossing, and 870 dead in towed hulls, having abandoned an assigned sweep, committed a frigate to a closed foreign case without orders, expended 6 survey drones from ship's reserve, and burned a drive past every rated limit in the manual. On paper, it was a catalog of violations. A frigate has a mission, and ours had not been to do any of this. There were officers at Holland, good officers, who looked at the paper and could not at first see past it, because the paper was their whole language too, the same way the Concordance's files were theirs. A captain who abandons his sweep and wrecks his ship is a problem, whatever he brings home in the hold. The Navy had a category for that, and the category was not a kind one. Hale stood his board the way he did everything, flat and unhurried, and offered no defense beyond the log. He did not plead the survivors. He did not invoke the watch. He laid the record on the table, the bounce onto the chapel band, the tag, the decision to turn, the drones, the overrun, the towing of the dead, and let it sit. And when the senior officer asked him whether he understood that he had hazarded a naval vessel and 41 crew on a case he had no orders to touch and no realistic prospect of resolving in time, Hale said, "Yes, sir, I understood it when I gave the order. I would give it again." And that was his whole defense. Yes, I understood. I would do it again. What saved Hale was not the survivors and not eloquence. It was the band. Because when the board pulled the full record to assess the hazarding, they had to pull the chapel band log too, and in pulling it, they had to confront the same wall the Concordance had hit. The thing the Wexford had answered was not, by any naval definition, a distress call she had been obligated to ignore or permitted to answer. It was grief on a comfort frequency that the Navy's own 300-year-old standing order required every vessel to keep lit and monitored. The order was ancient, and nobody remembered enacting it, and nobody had ever bothered to repeal it. And it said, in language older than anyone in the room, that the comfort band was to be kept open and attended at all times for the easing of the dying, and that any soul heard upon it in extremity was to be answered. Any soul, the order did not say human soul. 300 years ago, when no one had ever met another soul, no one had thought to write the word in. So the Wexford had not violated her orders. She had obeyed one so old the Navy had forgotten it was an order at all. She had a standing instruction to answer any dying voice on that frequency, and a dying voice had come, and she had answered it, and the fact that the voice belonged to a species humanity had never met did not exempt her from an order that had never specified the species. The board could not find Hale guilty of obeying a standing order. They tried. They could not. In the end, they did the only thing the law left them, which was to acknowledge that the order stood, that the Wexford had obeyed it, and that the Navy would now have to decide, 300 years late, what it actually meant to keep a door open for any dying soul in a galaxy that had turned out to be full of them. That decision took the Navy 2 years, and I was called to testify in most of it. They could have closed the loophole. They could have rewritten the standing order to say human, to fence the comfort band off as a domestic kindness and spare every future captain the choice Hale had faced. There were sound arguments for it. A frequency that obliges you to answer any dying voice in the galaxy is a frequency that can be used to pull your ships anywhere, by anyone, simply by dying loudly enough in range. It is a strategic vulnerability. It is an open door, and open doors are how things get in. I gave my testimony many times across those 2 years, to boards and committees, and once to an admiral who had flown frigates himself in his youth, and who wanted, I think, less to interrogate me than to understand a thing that had unsettled him. He asked me whether the Wexford would have turned if the song had been a Hale instead. A proper distress call, headers and all, lawfully aimed at someone. I told him I did not know, and that the not knowing was the point. A Hale you weigh. A Hale comes with a sender and a claim and a calculus, and a captain is entitled to run the numbers and decide it cannot be answered, the way the Concordance had run the numbers and been right. But the song had not asked. It had not aimed. It had simply gone up into the dark the way grief does, expecting nothing, and grazed a door we had left open, and there was no calculus for that because there was no claim in it, only a sound on a frequency we kept lit for the dying that our oldest order said must be answered. We did not weigh it. There was nothing to weigh. We answered it because the order said Annie, and because a chaplain on a stool had heard a death song and could not unhear it, and because Hale was the kind of man who, having heard, does not pretend he did not. The Admiral was quiet for a while after that. Then he said the thing that I think decided the whole 2 years of argument, though he was not on the board that ruled. The danger isn't that someone gains the open door, he said. Of course someone will, eventually. The danger is that we close it to be safe, and then 1,000 years from now some ship of ours hears a dying voice it has no obligation to answer, and runs the numbers, and is right, and leaves. And the worst part is nobody would ever know. There'd be no inquiry for the door we didn't open. The concordance left a field blank on a form to remember the one they missed. I'd rather pay for the door than spend forever not knowing what came down it while it was shut. They kept it open. After 2 years of argument, they kept it open. And they did more than keep it. They affirmed it, deliberately this time, with everyone in the room knowing exactly what the word any meant and choosing to leave it in. The standing order was reissued, current dated, in plain modern language, and it said that the comfort band was to be kept lit and attended aboard every human vessel at all times, that any dying soul heard upon it was to be answered, and that any meant any. They wrote the word in on purpose this time. They had been given the chance to make the kindness small and safe in ours, and they looked at what the accident of the old order had done. 279 living pilgrims attended graveyard, a 400-year-old empire leaving a field on a form blank forever, a faith that had learned the dark was full of doors, and they decided that vulnerability was the point. You cannot keep a door open only for your own and call it an open door. It is either open or it is a gate. They chose the door. The Wexford herself was repaired and returned to service, and is the last I knew, still flying, an old frigate now, outdated, kept on quiet runs the way you keep an old horse on gentle ground. Her chapel band closet has a brass plate in it now, small, that the crew put up themselves without authorization and that no inspector has ever ordered removed. It does not name the convoy or the keeper or the count of the dead. It says only the 2 words. I have sat that watch again on visits, on the same fold-down stool with the same brass speaker warm under my hand, and I have kept company with the dead frequency the way you keep company with an old dog, expecting nothing, and I have understood every time that the expecting nothing is the whole of it. You do not keep the watch because something will come. You keep it because someday something might, from a direction you cannot guess, in a throat you have never heard. And on that day, the only thing that will matter is whether the door was open. Ours was. It had simply never been turned off. The keeper and I were friends for the rest of his life, which is a strange thing to say about 2 beings who met across a dead frequency in the worst hour either of us ever lived and never did learn to pronounce each other's names correctly. He outlived the crossing by 19 years, a tidy number he pointed out to me once, dry in his full-throated way, the same number as the hours, 1 year for each hour he had sung. He never fully recovered the strength the death-rite had taken out of him. A being is not built to hold a door for 870 of his own and come away whole, and he did not come away whole. He came away gray and slowed and quietly burning down for the rest of his life, the way a coil runs after you have overrun it once. But he worked. He went back to the faithful, and he taught the new thing he had learned, that the dark is full of doors, and he trained the young ones who came after, including the girl who had been 9 on the second-to-last hull, and he built, this is the thing I am proudest of. Across the whole affair, he built doors, listening posts. The concordance after the treaty agreed to maintain a passive watch on the human comfort band. But the keeper went further than the treaty. He raised in his lifetime 11 comfort stations among his own people, 1 for each hull the convoy had lost, each one lighting a frequency for the dying of any species in range, each one staffed by someone trained to sit the watch and say the words. He called them the answered doors. He told me at the dedication of the first one that he had spent his life believing the rite was about the singing and had learned in 19 hours that it was about the door, that you could sing all you like, but if no one had kept a door open in your direction, the singing only ever reached your own. So he built doors in 11 directions against no return for strangers, because a human chaplain had taught him by accident that this was the highest form of his own right. We visited when we could, which across that distance was not often, and we wrote when we could not, which was constantly. His letters were formal and slow and very fine, and they got slower as the years took him, and I could read the strength going out of him in the lengthening gaps between them, the way I had once read it in the thinning of the song. I knew, the way I always know, when the gaps started meaning what they meant. I am a chaplain. Reading the approach of the door is most of the work. He sent for me at the end, which surprised me because his own people surrounded him, his own keepers, his own right, the whole architecture of accompaniment that his faith had built across however many thousand years. He did not need a human chaplain at his door. He had a faith full of singers and 11 stations he had built himself, and the girl who had been 9, grown now and ready to lead him across. He did not send for me because he needed me. He sent for me, he said, because there was a thing he wanted to ask, and he wanted to ask it of the man who had kept the band. I came. It was a long way, and I was not young either by then, and the Navy, to its credit, found me a berth on a ship going that direction without my having to ask twice, because the story had become by then a thing the Navy quietly carried. I sat with the keeper in a stillness house among his people, in a chamber kept dim and quiet for the dying in the way of their faith. The one dim room in this whole account, and the only place dimness ever belonged, and his throat had gone to almost nothing, the way it had at the very end in the dark 19 years before, and we had come full circle to two voices that could barely reach each other across a closing distance. "I am going to the door," he said. "My people will sing me across. The right is complete and correct, and I have no fear of it. I have spent my life at this door. I know it the way you know your closet." "I know," I said, "but I find," he said, "that I would like to hear the two words once more from the one who first said them before I go. Not as right. Your people do not make a right of it. You told me that the first hour, and I have always loved that it is not a right. I would like to hear it the way it was meant, so that I do not cross thinking the room was empty. A long breath, 4 lungs of it slow. I have a faithful of voices that will sing me across to my own. I know they are on the far side. But you taught me the dark is full of doors, and I find at the very end that I would like to go out having heard, one more time, the voice from the other kind of door, the one that was never supposed to be there and was. I am a chaplain. I have sat a great many doors. I have said the two words 10,000 times into dead frequencies and dying ears in the worst hours of strangers' lives, and they have never once cost me anything, because they are small words and saying them is the easiest part of a hard job. They cost me something that day. I had to wait a moment before I could give them to him cleanly, without the waver that would have made them about me instead of about him, because a man at the door does not need your grief. He needs your steadiness. The keeper himself had taught me that, holding his peoples across without breaking while I listened 19 years before. I took his cold gray hand, which his faith permits, and mine has no rule against, and I gave him the two words I had given him in the dark when we were both younger and the convoy was still alive and the math had not yet beaten us, the two words that the men who built the band had meant for exactly this and could not have dreamed would be meant for this. "Heard you," I said. And the keeper, who had held the last door for 870 of his own people without his voice breaking, and who had built 11 doors against no return, and who had taught a quiet, ancient, careful people that the dark was full of strangers keeping watch. The keeper smiled, in whatever way his face smiled, and his people lifted the death song around us both, and he crossed, accompanied, toward his own waiting dead and toward the door a human had kept open by accident, and he did not cross thinking the room was empty. I am an old man now, and they keep me on a station the way you keep an old chaplain, near a medbay and within reach of the dying, with a watch to sit and not much asked of me beyond the sitting. It is good work for the end of a life. I have made my peace with most of it. I sit the comfort band still on a different ship, in a different closet, with a different brass speaker, and I keep company with the frequency the way I have kept company with it for half a century, expecting nothing, which is the whole of the discipline. People ask me about it when they learn I was the chaplain on the Wexford, because the story has grown larger than the truth in the way stories do. They have made it into a rescue, mostly. The lone frigate that answered the prayer. They like the part where we turn, and the part where Pell names the drones, and the part where Adisa rides the coil to death and says that'll do to her dying engine, and the part where we save the 290. They like the keeper's line about the dark being full of doors. It has gone on to plaques. It is a good line, and he earned it, and I do not begrudge it the plaques. What they leave out every time is that we were too late. They sand that part off, because it does not fit the shape of a rescue, and a rescue is the shape they want. But I will not sand it off, because it is the only part that matters, and the keeper would not forgive me if I let it go. We were too late. We heard the song at hour 0, and we could not reach them until hour 19, and they had 14 hours of air, and no decision any of us made, no drone Pell named, no coil Adisa killed, no order Hale gave ever once closed that gap. 870 people died while we ran toward them as fast as a ship has ever run. The arithmetic that closed their case was right. We did not prove it wrong. We could not have. They were going to die before we got there, and they did, and nothing in the whole heroic shape of the story changes that. So why did we turn? The young ones ask me, the ones training to sit the watch, and I think it is the only question worth asking about the entire affair, so I answer it carefully, the same way every time. We did not turn to save them. We turned because they were going to cross, and crossing alone is the one cruelty we had it in our power to prevent. We could not give them their lives. The math had taken their lives before we ever heard the song. But we could give them the thing the song was actually asking for, which was not rescue. The keeper told me that the first hour, and the concordance jurist understood it on the second day, and it took the rest of them years. The song was asking that no one cross unattended, and that we could do. That a frigate 11 days out on a dead coil could do, even arriving too late, even with most of them already gone. We could be the voice on the far edge of the door. We could keep the company. We could make sure that 870 people dying in the dark on failing ships, going out one hull at a time, did not go out thinking the room was empty. We were too late to save them and exactly on time to keep them company, and the keeping of company was the whole of what they had sung for. We answered the prayer that was actually sent. It just wasn't sent to us. That is the thing I want set down at the end plainly, because the inquiry never managed it and the plaques never wanted it. The story is not that humans arrived in time. We didn't. The story is that the dark was full of dying people singing toward their own dead, and we had kept one door open for 300 years out of stubbornness and inertia, and a refusal to be the ones who turned it off. And on the morning a prayer went over it, we were standing there, the wrong ship, the wrong frequency, too small and too slow and too late, and we kept the door and we kept the company and we did not leave what we found. I sat the board when it was all over and filed my report, the way you file a report. The Navy wanted it in the standard form with the standard fields, and most of the fields did not fit, the same way the Concordance's fields did not fit, because a thing like this does not go into fields. There was a line at the bottom for the disposition of the contact. What was the result of the engagement? I sat in front of that field for a long time, an old chaplain who is not good with forms, and I thought about the keeper and the 870 and the 279, and the girl who had been 9 and the 11 doors, and the brass plate the crew put up without authorization, and the field on the concordance form that a jurist had left blank forever, and I thought about the 2 words that the men who built the band had meant for exactly this, and could not have dreamed would be meant for this. And then I filled in the field, because that is what you do with a field, and I have never been able to improve on what I wrote, and the Navy has never asked me to. Heard them, I wrote, answered, stayed.